It really is a delight to be here. It's obviously unusual to be able to lecture in your own building, and I'm very grateful to New College for organising the event and hosting. And this evening I'm going to give some background to this drawing. It's taken 9 years of working, and there's a lot of people in the room that have contributed to this. But it also is about a 600-year-long story about New College, particularly, but also the quad as a type. I also have other thanks before I kick off. So OPT, more broadly, the RIBA, Emily, Dan and Will Barker from my office, who've done a lot to organise the event and the slideshow. There's also members of the design review panel here, a number of former colleagues who worked on the project, who some I haven't seen for a few years, so it's really great they've made the trip. And for those that have come from London particularly, and as also someone from further afield, Cambridge, many thanks for coming. I should start by saying, despite the introduction, architecture is very much a team sport. This was an event that I think Jez Wells and Richard Bayfield organised in college. There were several of them, and they were to bring the construction team into the college as a way of celebrating progress. And I think a lot of effort over the last few years, which have been when there's been the most people involved, have been about trying to create a collaborative culture. Everything you see is really a product of that. And I always think that architecture really ought to be a bit like film. There should be scrolling credits at the end. It isn't quite the industry to produce that content, but all of these businesses, engineers, project managers, and the like were contracted by the college, and then also all of these businesses were contracted by Sir Robert McAlpine, who built the project, and all of them have a significant credit to receive for this project. And then also I said, there's members of the design review panel here. This probably also goes unrecognised often, is how involved city authorities are. And in a city like Oxford, it's very involved. We were just discussing how many meetings we'd had. It was meetings over several years with different stakeholders. And I can say this honestly, I think it massively improved the project to have that level of scrutiny. And so again, I think some had particular contributions to make. They encouraged the scheme to be what it is today. So I've got this in 3 parts. Something about the title, what is scenographic architecture? I'm actually going to talk about 4 projects. I'll give the lion's share to the Gradel Quadrangles, and I think that's the first time I mentioned. So Chris Gradel is the donor, who's named after, and he's an alumnus, so he also gets a large slice of credit for making this possible. Hasselt, Beguinage and SMAC, which are 2 ongoing projects in Belgium. And all of them, I think, have something to contribute to this idea of scenographic architecture. And then I'll wrap up with some concluding comments. So I'm going to dip in to start with to some architectural theory. I'm going to use some drawings. And I suppose this is the more kind of general ideas context in which I'd like this project and others to be understood. So, to kick off, this is 1545. These are drawings by Serlio, or someone commissioned by Serlio, to draw 3 stage sets. And this is after Vitruvius, and these figures are very important in the history of architectural theory. They were writers who put down on paper why and how to build. And this was one of 7 books, General Rules of Architecture, Volume 2, Perspective Painting. And the 3 images from the left are stage sets. And the first is, and this is translated from the original, so slightly quaint English. So a house for tragedies must be made for great personages, for their actions of love, strange adventures, and cruel murders, which is written Murthers, as you read in ancient and modern tragedies, happen always in the houses of great lords, dukes, princes, and kings. And I think the important thing to note from an architectural point of view is it's symmetrical, the buildings are substantial, there's a sense of a kind of orderly public realm. And Serlio is claiming that that orderliness is the kind of world in which great people go about their business and they are the subject of fate. Their destinies are preordained. Now, the middle section, this is the comical. Whereas the houses must be slight for citizens, but specially there must not be want for a brothel or a bawdy house, a great inn, a church. Such things are necessary to be therein. And I think this is a moment where architecture, form, buildings, public space starts to have a very particular social message, which is it's a different kind of city for different people. And those people are more subject to chance. Things happen to them that they didn't expect. And I think it's very interesting to reflect on the world that we now inhabit and to what degree these aspects are latent. And the last, the satirical, is to represent satires, wherein you must place all of those things that be rude and rustical, for which calls Vitruvius, this was this previous architectural theorist, speaking of scenes, saith they should be made with trees, roots, herbs, hills, flowers, and with some country houses. So, there's a sense that scenographic architecture is about representing the world as inhabited by people. And that there are clear aspects. There's always a foreground, a midground, a background. It's highly structured and it's varied. Now, if you go fast forward to, say, the 1730s, this is a drawing for a scheme by Capability Brown of Longleat, and I chose this because it's not too far from here. You can go see it. And some of those ideas that were previously theory for theatre making are now cropping up in landscape. And you'll be aware of the picturesque. And here there's a sense that the building is kind of artfully placed in a relationship to the trees to heighten their kind of picturesque delight. And an essay that was written some years later by Overdale Prince of this approach to design says, according to the idea formed of it, intricacy in landscape might be defined that disposition of objects which by a partial and uncertain concealment excites and nourishes curiosity. Variety can hardly require a definition, though. From the practice of many layers of the ground, one might suppose it did. Upon the whole, it appears to me that as intricacy in the disposition and variety in the forms and tints and the lights and shadows of objects are the great characteristics of picturesque scenery, so monotony and baldness are the greatest defects of improved places. Sometime later, this is now a much more rational theory taught by Jean-Nicolas Louis Durand, who became professor at the École Polytechnique. This is almost like the opposite. This is an idea of architecture as a system based on building blocks. And you can teach people how to start with. I mean, what's quite interesting, I always feel like when we go to looking at Great Quad and Garden Quad, there's some, from a four-sided to a three-sided. There is within this system the possibility of generating many architectural forms. And this was, the science of typology. Could you teach students to build anything from rudimentary building blocks? But of course, there's a lot of stuff stripped out. And this school was particularly allied to engineering. And the usefulness of this image is perhaps to be in contrast to this idea of a picturesque approach to theatre or landscape. And these opposing attitudes towards architectural design have continued up to the present day. So to return back to the theatrical, this is Schinkel, so an architect that designed theatre sets, designed buildings, designed cities. And he felt that one must above all aim to achieve a picturesque effect. One must give architecture the character of a theatrical setting. Every building should be a scene that pleases the eye and stirs the imagination. In the 20th century, in the UK, this started to take hold in the work of people like Raymond Unwin, who were part of the townscape movement around the 1920s. And this is a drawing of an ideal place. And you can see on the basis of the previous drawings and ideas, this is a confection of pretty houses and the church, guided by the eye, and informed by arts and crafts ideas which were previously about the single building. And now to bring us up to the contemporary, this is a drawing of landscape. And when I was a student in the US, this was I was being taught that actually landscape should be much more part of architectural discourse, and the way that buildings and cities are designed should be much more allied to the way landscapes are considered. And he's a current professor at Harvard, but this is in 1995, drawings about landscape typology. And in particular, this one's going to reappear down the line. And then I was taught by Stan Allen in Columbia, in the US, as mentioned earlier. And he was very interested in taking ideas to do with the digital and more like complex ideas to do with organization of parts, so swarms. And these are different ways of conceiving of spatial arrangements where there are many parts and the space between the parts becomes very significant. And again, this is going to make an appearance later. But there's kind of centuries of people musing about how to communicate the organization of architecture. Which brings us to the building we're in. And without giving it all away, one could pick many fragments of this image as illustrating aspects of those theories. I think, there was an instruction to Will Price, the photographer, that there be part of the frame of the arch, the sense of always needing a frame for the picture. There's the sense of a foreground, a midground, and a background that's very explicit. The role of the trees as being integral to the picture. The placement of the old listed house amongst the new. The diversity of openings, the inclusion of figurative sculpture. I could go on. But anyway, this I hope shows a connection between theory, teaching, education, and practice. So this is where I go a bit off-piste, and I'm going to talk about competitions that we've done, 4 of them, one of which, the Gradel Quadrangles. I would say that competitions have been crucial to our practice, in that those we've won have been the largest and biggest steps forward that we've made. So the practice was started in 2007. In 2009, we won an RBA competition. We were one of 3 finalists to design the art space of the future. And this was in a context of dwindling, it's ever thus, public funding for arts provision, and the RBA and the Arts Council, who fund public arts venues, so obviously as an architect, very important, asking if we can't afford arts provision in the future, and if there's a great need for more of it, particularly around areas of new housing in London, what could we do? And they were asking about how do we cope with the increased cost of energy, the effect of the climate crisis, how do we engage new audiences, who do we partner with? And our proposal was a landscape, a zero-carbon art park, to be exact. And we identified a park network in London. The stripes are willow coppice, which at the time was a low-carbon emitting crop that was being heavily subsidized by the government, low carbon in as much as it doesn't require extractive processes to get it out. And it runs on a 3-year cycle, so the entire network of art spaces in the park could be powered by the landscape. And if you imagine Tate Modern was in a power station, this would be a power station. And where the willow coppice is cut down, those become rooms for art. And there would be the kind of mothership, the venue that would hold the power station. And the power station would hold all the spaces that artists choose to work in, other than the White Cube Gallery, which is perhaps what we're most familiar with today. And artists choose to work in actually a much more diverse range of spaces than you'd think. There's a good example, Dealston Grove, which is a church. There's a library proposed, a tower, horizontal space, a domestic interior. And these would be gathered together like a building that had grown over time. So this is the Mezquita in Cordoba, which is like 8th century. And it was built up over about 600 years. It has both a church and a mosque in it, gardens, markets, buildings of various sizes. So again, if you think of those diagrams, this is moving away from architecture as this single thing, an object, to something much more hybridized that is about the relationship of parts one to another. And we imagined all of these idealized spaces that artists would choose to work in being gathered together and inserted in this new museum type. It would be built of timber, which this building has a lot of in the end, and that's also because of its carbon reduction opportunities compared to other materials. And then this was a cut-through model showing this diversity of spaces where there's ambiguity about what's inside, what's outside, there's gardens, there's a domestic space, a church hall, a library, all gathered into one. So, now to Gradel Quadrangles, which has been 9 years in the making. So the story starts with William of Wykeham, who you would have seen on the left as you came in, his kind of carved likeness. So he founded, in the 14th century, both New College and New College School, and shortly afterwards Winchester College. And the key move in the buildings that he made was to take buildings that were distributed across to Oxford, that would have been a chapel for prayer, somewhere to study, somewhere to live, somewhere to eat, and to turn them, a bit like a monastic cloister, into a single building. And that was a kind of radical project, a bit like kind of mixed-use development. And that was because town and gown was a very serious issue in the 14th century, and that led to violence, typically beer involved, and the quad was a way of isolating the institution from the city. So it was a kind of walled enclosure. And here you can see the land that was available was around the city walls, and front quad, which if you haven't been, I would absolutely recommend a 5-minute walk to the old campus, and cloister, which is famous for being in the Harry Potter movies, so you see that too, and then the bell tower, which you can see as you leave on the horizon. So not only did New College create the first designed and implemented in a single phase quadrangle, they also innovated the first 3-sided quad. And the fascinating thing is that at that moment, historically, the college started to invite wealthy townsfolk to take up residence. So the sense that the architecture represents some divide between city and institution is reflected in the changing social relationship between the institution and city, and the architecture literally opening up. And it was inspired in its day by the Cour d'honneur at the Palace of Versailles, which again, it's hard to think of it now, but a radical transformation of a 4-sided courtyarded building into a 3-sided open gesture where people are invited in. So here, this wonderful etching showing this contrasting attitude. But critically, there's this fence. So you'll know from those who've been to site, this side of the fence is the mound and the city walls. So there is a sense that whilst you can see nature, you're still separate. So the question for us in the brief was a college would like 100 new rooms on one of the last remaining sites that they have in Oxford, and they would like it to be in the tradition of the quad, but contemporary nonetheless. So a challenge, for sure. And not only that, we have the oldest one, and we have a history of innovating within the type. So that was the question they gave to each of the contestants. And the site, well, you'll know it because you're in it. So we're about here. You would have come in here. This is the grade 2 listed number 1 Savile Road. This house, Warham House, is replaced with New Warham House. So that's gone. This is a school gym, which has also gone and actually had a lot of issues at the time. It's built on the wall to the adjacent college, Mansfield, so it could only be maintained by scaffolding onto Mansfield's property. So there were a number of issues with it, but nonetheless, an extraordinary site, and as I said, the last that New College owned in central Oxford. Perhaps a critical other thing to point out, which the next slide illustrates, is at this moment in the city, there is a green swathe, a suburban strip, that reflects the development of this as 19th century villas in what was once countryside, but nonetheless the retention of a very green character. And this image shows, what it was like before it was developed. And from a planning point of view, this is a critical issue to address. So here you can see, you'll have walked towards this view, but quite significantly changed. But the major trees are there, and this kind of leafy context. A grade 2 listed house, so obviously it needs to be protected. This is Savile House. The wing here was built at the end of the 19th century with an extension that was built later. None of these rooms could be accessed by someone in a wheelchair, and because of them being staircases, they're also very difficult to modify. So perhaps when you're leaving, you will see that half of it's no longer there, and there's now a gap, and the new building inserted. There's the school gym, as I said, perhaps past its life, and this is the entrance that you came into. So a lot of the land on the site was gaps between buildings and between boundaries, so the surroundings of 19th century villas. So that was a great opportunity that you could aggregate all of these parcels into something much more substantial. This was the school forecourt. So again, if you get the chance, I'd go down there, and used by staff as a car park. So radically different today, and it was identified as an opportunity. And the Civil War ramparts. Now, would you believe it? This is a scheduled national monument. It was where Charles I defended the city of Oxford from the Roundheads, and it is here and was previously the bin store. So that was also an opportunity, how to make that into an asset. So you can see the buildings that were demolished, you can see the trees, the Civil War rampart along there with its widening here. So a very, very complex site, and the desire for a quad. So our challenge was to learn very quickly the kind of full gamut of quads, understand how they might be accommodated on the site, and these are all examples of previous quads from across the city. And this is a very early sketch, so we're now in 2015, and the suggestion that because this is listed, the only place you could build within its curtilage without affecting the listing is at the back. So then the idea of one could make 3-sided quads with gardens. And this is where an interesting conversation started to happen with Todd Longstaff-Gowan, a landscape architect, which had something to do with these diagrams that I was exposed to as a student. that were about trying to bring ideas about landscape and how they knit with other types of environment into cities. And the question that arose, how does one take the previous version of New College with these closed and open quads and arrive at something that bled from the landscape, the gardens, into the quad, and there was some equivalence between building and landscape, between the institution and nature. So that division that occurred in Garden Quad would now be taken away, and there'd be a celebration of these things coming together. So this was the proposal, and you can see that that turned a site that had many different parcels and arguably wasted space into suddenly a space that you could fit 100 rooms, a lecture hall, study space, etc. The removal of Warham House, which had been the subject of multiple planning applications over years, and that was only made possible by actually aggregating the whole site and having a master plan that this finally gained planning permission. And at the end, the idea that this could actually retain and enhance that suburban belt of green trees. And here's the final plan with the years, 1935, I think I said late 19th century. So, the 1902 listed house, 1903 by the same architect but unlisted New College School. And the importance of dividing the school from the college is achieved by the wing of the main quad, with these spaces becoming part of the school courtyard, main quad, central courtyard, and what we've called East Quad at the entrance, then New Warham House and its tower, and the gatehouse that you would have come through. I think going back to the beginning of the lecture and this idea of evolving ideas about the scenographic in theatre and landscape, there is actually a very specific Oxford precedent, which is Nicholas Pevsner's Visual Planning and the Picturesque. There's a beautiful story to this. It was written in the 1940s. It went into an archive in Los Angeles. It was only discovered at the beginning of the 20th century by a PhD researcher who then published this book. And it's full of walks through Oxford that create framed picturesque views of the existing architecture. So here you see All Souls. And this is part of 10 images commissioned by Pevsner to illustrate a walk around New College, each framing the city with the suggestion that this attitude, which he argued was counter to French Beaux-Arts planning with rigid axes and organization, was a very English way to expand and densify cities, which is making decisions as you go along, making picturesque relationships between what was there and what you want to add, such that the Bridge of Sighs feels like expertly there to frame the view beyond. It also raised the question then, if type is fundamentally the thing that all of these types of buildings share, yet they're all different, if we know what the type should be, three-sided with an equal landscape, what should the architectural language be? Because these are all the same type, but they're all completely different architecturally. And so that's also an interesting distinction that this project allowed us to explore. We thought that the architecture, well, the planners thought too, particularly, that the architecture needed to be very much in keeping with what was there. So if you drew profiles of each of the surrounding buildings, one was very conscious that they have this kind of staccato rhythm of gable ends, and you can see how the kind of neo-Gothic of 1895 softens into the arts and crafts of 1902, Savile Road, and that New College School is somehow a hybrid of the two. And we felt that an architecture that emulated that, a certain percussiveness, but nonetheless had this more fluid language that came from the discussions around landscape, would be much more appropriate. And I think many people have said it looks a bit like a Gaudí, or perhaps lesser known outside of architectural circles, Mendelssohn's Einstein Tower. And yes, all of those are possible precedents. But it was the specific context of the site that then allowed us to develop a unique response where all of the parts are seeking to play off each other and to construct this journey through the site. So, I hope this is going to... The next part, so we're about 10 minutes to go, I think. It might go slightly over. This is a very exciting video, I hope it plays, by Sir Robert McAlpine. And the extraordinary thing was that I'd never seen this before. They made this just to win the job. So let's see. So you should know the parts by now, slightly speeded up, but they showed this to us in a bus as we drove to the Bloomberg building in London that they completed. And it's fair to say everyone was completely blown away. And it is, a time-based animation of the building. And it pretty much happened like that. It took a while longer. But yeah, exciting bit, okay. So you are sitting about here. So the other thing I think is difficult to realize is quite the energy, the effort, the kind of technical difficulty of making a project like this. I mean, these are the piles. These are the temporary works just to stop the walls falling in while the piles cure, I think. But it's just pretty mind-blowing. We're in the sixth layer that is the finest materials close to your body, but behind this is this. And I think it's really important. I mean, there are some people from the SRM team here just to appreciate quite what they had to do to deliver this. And I think this is Tim Lucas's sketch. Found this. So structural engineers, Price and Myers. And this is going back to the competition stage. If we want a curved building and it should be stone, let's make it load-bearing stone, which will give it a lifespan that is considerably more than, say, stone tiles, which are a kind of superficial cladding. And this was an interest in making blocks that interlocked. And these are little videos that show the quarry cutting out each stone. And then just to give you a sense again of just like the weight of every stone that you see on the outside is so great that this is the machine you need just to carry it around the quarry. I just don't feel it's difficult to appreciate the labor that goes into this, not just on site, but in many places beyond. And this is in the effort of making a facade that catches the light, that in a south-facing courtyard gives a sense of the passage of time, that the diagonal block accentuates the curvature of the building, so heightening the kind of delight. There was a structural timber scheme that was introduced, and drawings by Purcell and, again, Price and Myers, looking at how to turn what was previously a concrete structure, with some input from Barbara Rossi at New College on the technical side, into a carbon-saving timber solution, which won the project Institute of Civil Engineers Carbon Champion Award. And there's the home bursar, Jez Wells, in the yellow high-vis, in Switzerland, checking each of the beams. So every one of those is cut by a machine. And then this is probably my favorite drawing in the entire deck. This is an algorithm that takes all of the CAD models of the beams and works out how to fit them in the smallest area for shipping. So this is the inside of a crate. Yeah. And that's all in the service of making this undulating roof form. And And on the same trip, with Mike Adams, late night, we worked out how could we tessellate the tiles. This is in Winter Tour 22, and sure enough, with a lot of other input from many other people, these clusters, these kind of floral clusters of different tiles, I think it's an algorithm, again, by Price and Myers, trying to understand how you can take 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7-sided polygons and tessellate them across a curved surface. And this is what it looked like before it looks like what you've seen today. And again, Mike Adams and the SRM team performed something of a miracle in finding a technical way of building out from the timber structure to this tessellated roof form, which in the completed building looks like this. But you will perhaps see in some places it's not quite finished. So today is a sneak peek. There's ongoing works, and this actually hasn't been shared in the public, and I think it won't be until next year. So, and then to finish the part about New College, it's just the walk from Mansfield Road, the tower that now marks it out as a collegiate site, the Gatehouse with new gates by Eva Rothschild, who won a competition run by the college for public artwork. You can see that the gates are actually, there's a skew which aligns it with this view, which I mentioned before, with all of its parts working off each other. And then coming to the northern end of the first quad that you enter, the view in this gap, you can now see the civil wall ramparts the first time and approach them. And then this typical condition in colleges where you move from one outdoor space to another through the building allows you to have moments like this, and then the kind of full expression of the kind of curvaceous architecture, with some wonderful gargoyles and grotesques, and these are all the animals which were chosen because they represent perhaps nature under threat, and we worked with Ashley Griffin, the Professor of Evolutionary Biology at New College, to choose suitable subjects. So perhaps there's also trying to be as contemporary as possible in acknowledging what's happening in the world. So in the last 5 minutes or so, I'm going to show a couple of projects that we're working on, which I think have very much built on the research that we did at New College. So this was one 3 years after we won the competition here, and I would say when I show you the scheme, it was only probably winnable because we could demonstrate we had some experience of working with this type of architecture. So Hasselt, it's a regional town in Flanders. At the centre is a beguinage. It's like almshouses for, well, traditionally it's for women who were not within a religious nunnery, but would provide a kind of a home that was separate from the city at large. So in a way, it functions a bit like a college. At the centre of the beguinage, which is this kind of ring of houses, was the church, which was the tallest building in Hasselt. Very sadly, as happened in many places across Europe, it was bombed in the war, and so this kind of tallest building in the centre of the beguinage at the heart of Hasselt for decades was left like this. And we won the competition to effectively save the whole complex from being bought by a private developer by returning it to public use as an architecture faculty for the University of Hasselt, but also as a regional destination for the wider area. So there's been funding being drawn for both city, university, and region. And that was done by inserting a tower that would regain the height of the church within this complex, so that, a bit like the tower here, you would recognize the site's centrality and importance from a distance as before. We would stabilize the church ruin, bring it into public use, achieve much greater permeability. So there's an entrance gate here, and then the walled compound, which was obviously about separating the institution from the city, we would puncture with new holes, and the roofs, we would add substantial dormers to allow them to become studios for architecture students. And there was a long process of drawing, every part of this. I mean, it's interesting working with existing buildings, the effort it takes to actually get to know them before you can then make changes, which sometimes are modest but with significant impact. There isn't the time to go into detail, but this is an example where we've inserted an auditorium to allow for that program, and there's new vertical cores with lifts, etc., to make everything disabled access. And then this is particularly interesting in terms of use. So this fairly forlorn, bombed church ruin will become a reflective pool, a fountain that has a drainage possibility that can be used for graduation ceremonies, public events, celebrations. And again, a short walk through. So these are the refurbished entrance building, this new public path into, and at the other end, this is the kind of puncturing the lining with new openings, a public park that is funded by the city, with the reflecting pool and the church ruins beyond. That is something, sometimes a meditative space, sometimes a public venue for events. And then this new tower, which provides views across the city and itself can be seen once again, and a suite of new studios for architecture students in the roof by virtue of these very large dormer windows that bring in natural light. And here you can see it's on site. There's the church. You can see all of the ivy's been stripped, the materials have been stabilized, the fountain's going in. We just cut the hole in the wall, so you can now walk into what was once a very closed world. A lot of work to bring back the interiors with new timber structures where necessary, a kind of surgery to make the most of what's there. And then these very generous dormer windows to bring daylight into the studios. And lastly, the tower, which has probably got a few months still to go, but it is rising. And then the last, we're a bit over time, but this is the last one. So this is a competition we won this year, and I suspect will take us to the end of the decade, if the current one's anything to go by. And it's SMAC. It's a museum of contemporary art in Belgium for one of the country's foremost public collections of contemporary art. It's an extraordinary site, again. It's a 1915 World Fair pavilion for flowers. So it's called the Florianhal, and a huge, beautiful structure that was actually designed to be a train station in Kinshasa. It never left Belgium, and clearly someone working for the World Fair thought, we'll have that. And it's one of only two railway stations with a kind of rotating pin joint, so for those into railway structures, it's very special indeed. But at the end of the building were casinos, which were kind of celebratory spaces with restaurants and gathering event spaces, etc. So it's in a park. So that's the Florianhal. And these are buildings that were built later. The SMAC, the art museum, currently occupies the pavilion at this end that you saw in that view. And the brief was to double the size of this and add the same again over here. And the brief was to demolish the building. But there was no way to meet their needs without doing so. This is a fragment of something that preceded all of this, which was there was a fort on the site, and this was a gateway to the fort. So, our approach, which has been informed by the previous projects I've shown, was to absolutely retain the structure. We had an engineer redo the calculations and demonstrated that if you kept all the materials on site, you could ensure that you could achieve a much lower embodied carbon over the lifetime of the building and expose the structure to allow it to be expanded. With a mirror on the other side, that the footpath that would take you to the hall, we would then angle the architecture to respond to it, so that this room becomes very much embedded in the museum and a potential large public forecourt, if you think about the Turbine Hall at Tate as an example, or the forecourt to the Pompidou. And crucially, this forgotten fragment of a 19th century fort becomes the entrance. So again, this kind of picturesque attitude towards combining fragments to make a pleasing journey. This is unpleasing in my view. It's the facade of the gallery. It feels a bit like a slightly fascist train station from 1930s Italy, possibly. Anyway, that's something to do with the very elongated openings, the use of stone. Yeah, anyway. So, you don't want your art gallery to look like that, but you don't want to get rid of it all. So, we imagined a kind of on-site brick quarry where you take all the bricks, they've got soft joints, you take them all down, you lay them all out in that hall, you cover the structure with insulation, and you build a new facade. So none of the materials have left site. You've had to bring no new materials, and you can have a very different architecture that has a much more open aspect. You can see the museum inside. And on the inside, the museum now has these kind of processional stairs, balconies. It's a very active, permeable architecture that is making a connection between this former flower hall and the museum proper. And again, this sense that the museum frames itself, that there's always this reflexive relationship of the parts to the whole. So, in conclusion, towards a scenographic architecture, I'm advocating that some of the things that we've researched and learnt along the way are very effective in many contexts and could become an attitude to practice more broadly. And that it's possible that within theatre and landscape are ideas that you can look tangentially at architecture and enrich it without feeling like the idea has to be exclusively, thinking back to that Durand drawing of reducing architecture to some kind of system, that theatre and landscape bring a richness to understanding buildings. Thank you.
Themselves, but actually they also help kind of illuminate further what it is that you've been doing here. I know we've overrun a bit, but you did say you would be happy to answer a couple of questions.
Sure.
And Emily, can't see her, but she has got, there she is. She's the roving mic. So would anybody like to kick off with a question?
Yeah.
What's the most difficult part of this project?
Sorry?
What's the most difficult part of this project?
Oh, wow.
The client at the beginning, or was it technical stuff? Was it the kind of...
The most difficult part. Well, the thing that seems quite fresh, it's difficult to finish things.
Yes.
I mean,
Yes.
whether it's the side return at home, which I'm trying to finish, or a building this size, I think it's a challenge. I mean, there's something about construction, the way it's procured, the way that there's a kind of diminishing, certain values diminish as you proceed, and I think that's hard. I'd say that because actually building it was the most wonderful, fantastic, exciting, rewarding, collegiate experience. You know, it's just there's so much drama in making something. So, but finishing that is hard. Yeah.
I think there's a John over there. So, would you like a mic?
Thanks for a really informative presentation and for me a better understanding of the form, shape and placing of the building. I'd like to know a little bit more though about how you consider the way we, let's say we the public, well I've got an architectural background, but how we the public view and read a building such as this. For example, the polygonal roof tiles over double curved surfaces. And windows are different shapes. I don't mean just the rectangular windows, but certainly the windows on the tower. Yeah. So it's kind of an open question, really, which is to do with, does that, to what extent, not saying it very well, does it matter? But what I'm saying is, what is your expectation, or what is the world in which you are in that would help us to simply read it and understand it?
Thanks, yeah, that's very good question. I mean, I have a strong feeling architecture is always in the public domain. So, you know, if you're thinking like, you know, when texts went through decades of a transition from what a writer means is everything to what a reader interprets is everything. And that, you know, that was, you know, I suppose deconstruction as a kind of literary exercise. When I was a student, that was what was going on. I think there's a lot to learn from those kind of processes in valuing architecture, which is, I do think, what you see in it is what it is. You know, I mean, it's kind of, it has a value in how you interpret it, no matter who you are. And I would say that, for me, architecture that welcomes multiple interpretations is generous. Now, you know, how does one make architecture that invites multiple interpretations? I think some of the strategies I've described, I believe, do. I think, you know, the 20th century, there was a lot of suggestion that if you understand the ideology, you will appreciate the building. Don't worry about the fact that you don't like it or that you can't see anything in it. You know, and I think that that's not a very new attitude. I think, you know, say modernism has been challenged for 70 years by architects wondering whether there was a lot about vernacular architecture and the way that everyone chooses to live, that it's absolutely as valid as any architect's doctrine about, you know, this is the right architecture. So I would say, I see it also a bit like enjoying art. You know, in a way, you don't have to know what it is to enjoy it, but there are certain certain types of art practice that make that very open to you. And there are others that kind of say, you've got to read this to understand that. And I'm more in favour of something open. Oh, yeah, sorry. You're next.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for the talk. And it was especially great to hear more about the detailing aspects of the design. I just wanted to ask, does the typical design process start with the detailing, or is it usually the overall composition and the proportionality that comes first? Yes.
That's a good question. So I remember I was taught by Dominic Cullinan, a very good, great architect, great teacher. I mean, he was always saying, you know, you would advise working at the larger scale and the smaller scale at the same time. I think that's very good advice. I think logically you'd start at the biggest thing and end at the smallest thing. I think that building design doesn't work like that in experience so well. And I think there's a lot of problems that result from an attitude like that. Obviously, it makes it more complex if you're doing the smallest thing and the largest thing at the same time. But I would say that's what architects, that's what all that training was for, and that's what practicing architecture should allow you to do, is to find strategies for. So I think that I showed Tim's sketch of a stone block. I think that was literally during the competition stage. Here's a good example. I would never now do a competition without having all of the team members that I would eventually want to work on the project with, including a cost manager, including a contractor. Even a few hours of a contractor looking at a scheme, they're going to tell you something very, very valuable and, save you a world of pain, probably the clients a lot of money. But, sorry, Dan.
Thanks very much for a really fascinating talk. I wonder if you could say a little bit about, a little bit more perhaps about the way that the scenographic approach influences the design process from the inside out.
Sure, sure.
Creating outdoor rooms and the integration of landscape with architecture and the spaces between buildings.
Yeah.
This, on the face of it, is something which perhaps relates more to an outside-in approach.
Mm-hmm.
It would be interesting to hear you say a bit more about the way in which the scenographic approach influences the inside out.
Yeah, yeah.
Did you want to hear that? Yeah, question.
Yeah. No, very good question. And it's fair to say that it is a building primarily for student rooms. So the majority of what you're looking at does have cellular spaces of between 15 and 20 square meters in it. It's probably the case that the lecture's slightly skewed for reasons of time, partly, and also we've documented the outside much better so far than the inside. But I think also at the point of the competition, we said that, and this is a bit like a quad, but with a twist. We thought every room should be different. If you go to a new college, you will be given there'll be some kind of ballot or choice. Jez will probably explain it as to how you end up with a room, and there will be. Inevitably, because it's architecture, there will be better or worse rooms. There will be rooms with, the situation you don't really want is that there's a few rooms that everybody wants, and they look towards the river, and everyone else got the kind of the lesser room. So one approach to that is to make something where there's delight fairly liberally spread across the campus, and everyone has something to look at. And so certainly the form of the building did allow a lot of views. So I mean, what's interesting in this view is, it's deliberate that window sees the entrance gate. And one of the conditions that the city put on the scheme was that Oxford colleges, in our view, are too closed. We want the public to see into colleges. So if you take that to its logical extreme, you want them to see as far as you can in a college, which this does. So, at that moment where you walk past the gates, you see as far as one can into New College. And that's reciprocal. Then also the students in that particular location see, I think probably another, there aren't really, let's say, this, so it's a quad, but given the, as was required by the brief, but given the site, it's in terms of Oxford's quads at the small end. But each window faces a different way, has either a landscape with a desk against it, or a portrait window with a seat that you can sit in, all of the rooms on the top floor, which we don't have photographs of in this set, have curved ceilings, so they're not hung ceilings. You experience the vault of the architecture. These rooms have duplex units with bed balconies and stairs. So to go back to your question, the intention was that there would be a lot of variety, and so that the kind of pleasing aspect of being in the campus is not just on the outside, it's also on the inside. Richard.
Thank you very much, David, for your excellent presentation. From the client side, I go back to the very first question when you were asked what was the most difficult moment. And I remember when we introduced Sir Robert McAlpine's team, Ridge and the rest of the project delivery team, including myself, had spent a lot of time interviewing contractors. And then you suddenly came into the room with Sir Robert McAlpine. You started a presentation just like this one, and you said, of course, I don't know how we're going to build it. And I think that was comforting because I didn't know how we were going to build it. It was very honest. And I think we tried right from the start to be very collaborative and create an atmosphere of trust and collaboration. And the college motto is manners maketh man or woman, a culture of respect. But I think to establish that honesty very early on, and to then test how we might change a concrete roof for another material, timber and so on, was really part of the journey that made this such an exciting project to work on for all of us. I really like the way you showed the credits at the start of your presentation. I think that's really important. It's often forgotten who did the work, and likewise the way in which the college respected those actually doing it and took them into the oldest dining room in either Oxford or Cambridge for breakfast on occasions. So congratulations, thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
I have a question, actually.
Yeah.
David, you mentioned scenographic architecture, but for us, it's very difficult to understand, or at least for me. Well, in the current context of climate change, we talk about resilience and flexibility and circularity and modification of things during the life of the buildings. And I wonder how you reconcile scenographic architecture with flexibility.
Sure. Great question. So I would say this is one branch or one decision tree, and the other one implied by your question, I think, is there a way of designing architecture such that it's very flexible to many uses, and would that tend towards something that is formally, materially much simpler? I.e., if it was a kind of a box, a nice box, but a box, could you do more with it in the future? I think there is a lot of architecture that pursues that agenda. I think there's a lot of problems with it in that it entirely misses the social sustainability dimension that architecture, I think, is intrinsically bound up in, which is the buildings that really endure are the ones that we love and the ones that we want to keep using. And, the campus across the road, Great Quad, it's highly idiosyncratic. It's unchangeable, yet it's been used effectively for 620 years. So you could say at this point in our history where there's huge concern over minimizing carbon, and the construction industry is probably responsible for, 35% of all carbon emissions. It's a huge responsibility we have, and architects probably have a very large part to play in steering the agenda. I would say that there is, if you can, there is as much to achieve for the reduction of carbon and the long-term life of buildings through making very substantial, very robust buildings that absolutely work for their clients and users, and that those decades, dare I say, centuries, will pay, you know, the kind of carbon, embodied carbon cost multiple times over in a way that you just couldn't achieve. The school building arguably was the most flexible box imaginable, and it was the first building to go because it was just not built at all well, it wasn't sited well, and no one loved it. Yet the school building from the 19th century, you know, it's impossible to use and everyone loves it and there's no way they're going to change it. And that's something, I think that's something crucial to do with type, as opposed to other aspects of architecture. You know, I mean, type is the thing that's very consistent.
I think one more question, and then we're going to go and have a drink. So yes?
Thank you, David. A really good, lovely lecture. I'm looking at this image and I'm thinking about, I was reading a book the other day about, it talks about the trace of the hand in making something, and how you have perfection and imperfection, and how, you know, there's one view of the world where you look at completely, you know, perfect object and then imperfect objects. And I'm looking at the trace of the hand, but also the trace of the constraint in this. And I'm sort of looking at how the roof is faceted, how those zigzags of pink and cream stone ended up being there. You were started with that. I wondered how you see that sort of either, well, both the trace of making and the trace of practical constraints, and how that's ended up on building for you.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is, I love this image, because it was quite unexpected, and Will Price, the photographer, took it with a drone a couple of weeks ago. And it's very good for showing, as you point out, like all the variety, which perhaps you don't see initially because there's a strong form, but yeah, there is a huge amount of diversity in the parts and in the materials. And I think that, I mean, to go back to Richard's point, I mean, I love materials, I hope that came across, I love construction, I love the idea of making things. I really enjoy talking to people who make stuff. I mean, the Grants of Shoreditch are the stone subcontractor. I mean, they're like alchemists, you know, they turn this material in the quarry, and they did an exceptional job. I mean, they're just so skilled. And I think the variety comes from an interest in craft making, knowing what, how to do something, injects, I mean, this is slightly arts and crafts, William Morris territory, but I think it injects a certain patina and character into materials, as opposed to perhaps if you say, here's the form, okay, I'm not interested in how it's clad, please can we find the most cost-effective means to put a surface on it. I mean, a lot of architecture is made like that, and it immediately lacks. And to go back to Barbara's question, as soon as you lack those things, it's very hard to love something that is forever chipping and delaminating and falling off, and I think that comes as a result of industrialized processes where no one has a very great interest in how quality is achieved.
Thank you. Well, I'm sure we all have to thank you, David, for a really stimulating lecture. Great to be here, and I think we're now going to go and have a drink. I'm looking at Stephen, who is actually, the person who's in charge of everything tonight, really. We're all going to have a drink, but first, let's show our appreciation to David for a wonderful talk.